You are listening to EETimes on Air, and this is EETimes Current. I'm Taylor Marvin. Welcome to Brains and Machines, a deep dive into neuromorphic engineering and biologically inspired technology. This episode features Dr. Brad Aimone of Sandia National Laboratories talking about neuroscience and large-scale neurocomputing. Your hosts are Dr. Sunny Baines of University College London and Dr. Giulia De Angelo of the Czech Technical University in Prague.
Welcome to Brains and Machines. I am Giulia D'Angelo.
And I'm Sunny Baines.
In today's episode, Sunny is talking with a neuroscientist turned neuromorphic engineer, Dr. Brad Aimone, who works at the Center for Computing Research at Sandia National Laboratories. After the interview, we will be talking to Ralph Etienne Cummings from Johns Hopkins University about the issues raised.
Thanks, Giulia. One of the reasons I wanted to have Brad on the show this month is that he recently brought out a paper proposing how we can take serious steps towards a real theoretical framework for neuromorphic engineering. This could help us get to design rules that highlight when neuromorphic technology is worth using and when it's not. He and his team have done a lot of work on the theory side, in particular showing how Monte Carlo simulations can be sped up with neuromorphic systems. However, he's also realistic about the fact that, energy advantages aside, neuromorphic computation has its limits. There are links to his work and some of the specific papers we'll be discussing on our website. You can check them out at brainsmachines.net. Brad Aimone, welcome to Brains and Machines.
Thank you very much, Sunny. It's exciting to be part of this podcast.
So let's start off by talking about your technical background. What did you study and how did you end up in neuromorphic engineering?
Like many people in our field, my path to neuromorphic computing didn't start off that way. I didn't even think about being a neuroscientist or a computing person. My original area of study was chemical engineering, and this was back in the time when that basically meant working in the oil industry. But as I finished undergraduate at Rice University, I realized I wanted to do more in biological research. So I made my way to Southern California, to San Diego at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. And I got a job doing bioinformatics research. So this was the early days of looking at big data and data science. People didn't really know what to call it at the time. Biology was kind of having a renaissance of high throughput screening of gene expression and things like that. So I came in with my engineering background and developed some algorithms and analysis techniques for looking at microarray gene expression experiments. And that was very exciting, and it was kind of a new area of research. But what really set me on my path is I was in a laboratory, Rusty Gage's lab at the Salk, that had been one of the first labs to study adult neurogenesis, which was discovered that human brains do have new neurons integrating into our hippocampus throughout life. And so this was pretty early days in that sort of research. And a few people, not part of our group, had started doing some computational modeling of this process. So Rusty Gage was like, well, we should be doing some of that. And I was an engineer and I had modeling experience. So I started doing this modeling work. And one thing led to another, and I started moving away from the bioinformatics into the neuroscience modeling direction and found myself in graduate school in a computational neuroscience program that had started at UCSD, which is across the street, that Terry Snowski and a few other people had got going, one of the earliest comp neuro programs in the country, and got my PhD doing theoretical neuroscience, large-scale models and simulations of the neurogenesis process in the brain. After several years of doing that in graduate school and a short postdoc, I found my way to Sandia National Laboratories, which really is focused on computing. And this was exciting to me because one of the challenges in neuroscience broadly, and especially computational neuroscience, is we want to be able to see the work we do impact the world in our lifetimes. And this is something that's very difficult in neuroscience, particularly theoretical and systems neuroscience type efforts. And computing makes for a very immediate feedback. If you're bringing neuroscience into computing, and we're seeing this with AI today, things you work on have the potential to make it into society and impact the world. So I found this very exciting to go to a national lab and to think about how the brain can impact computing. And that has taken different forms. And this was before neuromorphic computing really kind of started exploding, as it did maybe about 10 years ago with the True North chip hitting mainstream, so to speak, and before AI really took off. But of course, those sort of things started happening as I was kind of getting my feet underneath me at the national labs. And we've just started embracing this sort of brain-inspired computation idea and been doing it ever since.
Great. So I want to go back a little bit before we get to Sandia and talk about some of the work you did in San Diego. One of the papers that you wrote, you were still primarily a neuroscientist, showed how important this neurogenesis or new neuron growth could be in the hippocampus. I'm going to give you my interpretation and then you can explain it properly. But my take on this is essentially that as that part of the brain is evolving, new neurons turn into teenagers, and at that point, they enthusiastically encode new events for a couple of weeks until they get old and jaded, and then the next generation takes over. So essentially, these different ages of neurons end up a bit like tree rings, providing a timestamp for the events that they remember.
Yes, I think that's actually a pretty on-the-nose description of what the neurogenesis process is doing. So part of the challenge is that most of us were taught at a young age that our brains don't have new cells. By the time you get to about 10 years old, 12 years old, you have the neurons you have for the rest of your life, and that's that. And so it's kind of all downhill from there. And it turns out this isn't really the case. I mean, it's the case for most of the brain, but not for a few areas. And so the modeling work that we were doing was really asking the question, what does it mean to add new cells to an existing neural network? Now, this is very timely today in the mindset of artificial neural networks and thinking about online learning and things like that. But this was 20, 25 years ago. There wasn't really a lot of neural network attention going on. And so we started thinking about really where you were saying, these hyperactive teenagers, the cells coming online, they're newborn in the context of a mostly old cell. So it's a very small population of neurons. The vast majority of neurons there have been around for a long time. They're wired up. They've made their connections. They've learned what they're going to learn. And you have this local stem cell population turns into neurons gradually. What was observed in the biology experiments was that the connections that they form, the learning that they do, whether or not they even survived, was heavily dependent on the activity and the inputs the mouse or rat was experiencing at the time. So what we, through the modeling work and looking at the circuitry and these dynamics, began to appreciate was that you end up having this case where the vast majority of cells are very quiet and relatively specialized to only a very small subset of inputs. Basically, you could think of these as your expert witnesses or the expert scientists that know one thing and one thing only, but they're really, really good at that thing. And those are fantastic. You want to have those experts. But in life, and this would be the case for mice, rats, or humans, we're going to experience things that are completely novel. And if all you have are distinguished professors who are experts in one narrow area of research, and something new comes along, like, say, AI explodes out of the scene or whatever, you need to have some young, fresh minds to integrate over that stuff. And you don't want to get rid of the experts, but you want to have new expertise form in new ways. And that's basically the idea that we saw that these new neurons may be providing to the dentate gyrus, the part of the brain that receives them, which is basically saying that if you experience something really novel, a new memory, a new episodic experience, then you're going to want to have some sort of novel encoding capacity, new dimensions, if you will, to make those connections. Now, there's some fun things that fall out of that. The story that we always say is, if you hear a song that was a hit when you were a teenager and it comes on the radio, you'll be taken back in time to something that happened around it. The fact that those neurons were young at the time, encoding that song, basically forms a temporal connection, temporal associations. So we proposed several of these theories, like this sort of temporal association, this pattern integration, this novelty representations. And subsequently, in the last 20 years, people have done different experiments and seen aspects of that actually in the activity of these new cells in the adults. So that some of these ideas have been verified. It's a very hard area to study. It's deep in the brain. There aren't a lot of new neurons. So it's still to be determined whether or not this really is as impactful as we proposed. But what I think is very interesting and important is the fact that we need this capability in today's AI methods. We're trying to adapt things that are extremely expensive to train, and we would like to be able to deploy them in the world and kind of let them do their thing and adapt on the fly without us having to go in there and rebuild the whole models. And that sort of neurogenesis-inspired AI and adaptation and stuff is something that I'm very excited to see that people have looked at in the field. And they go back to this original literature from 20 some odd years ago where these theoretical neuroscience ideas were first proposed.
Fantastic. So you've done a lot of work on expanding theoretical computer science to accommodate neural and neuromorphic computing, including a really interesting paper that's just come out in the last few months and has had a lot of buzz already. But before we talk about that work, which we will get into in depth, I'd like you to explain why neuromorphic machines are better suited to running Monte Carlo simulations, perhaps as a way of easing us into the topic. And perhaps you'll tell us a bit about what they're useful for, but I know they're useful in lots of different kind of engineering applications.
Yes, I think, one of the things that we discovered in the last 5 or 6 years has been an appreciation that neuromorphic hardware is very well suited for things that may not have been expected, one of which is the Monte Carlo simulations that you mentioned. If you look at the brain, this isn't actually entirely unexpected. In our brains, the vast majority of connections between neurons, the synapses, are probabilistic in nature. So whether or not the neuron upstream fires, whether or not the neuron downstream receives information through that synapse, is kind of a coin flip. It may or may not happen due to some probabilistic vesicle release is what we call it. And that's not an artifact of noise and just the brain is messy, carbon and fat and whatnot, but rather it's an intentional thing. This is something that the brain appears to put a lot of control and regulation on. And so back in the early days of neuromorphic hardware, the True North chip, the Loihi chip, some of these other, Spinnaker chips, the engineers building these chips put these random number generation capabilities on the chips. Now they're pseudo-random numbers, but they're all over the chips because neurons look noisy in biology, so they put this noise capability on the hardware. So 6 or 7 years ago, we were looking at some of this hardware as it was beginning to scale up, and we asked, okay, well, if we want to apply low-power neuromorphic capabilities towards real computing applications, not necessarily AI, but thinking about things that are big problems that people build supercomputers for, what would be an easy target? And one of those things is Monte Carlo simulations. Now, Monte Carlo is a very broad class of algorithms. Monte Carlo being a city in Europe that has lots of casinos. So the idea with the Monte Carlo algorithm is I flip a coin and I make my number go up or down according to the outcome of that coin. And I do this over and over again. And that allows me to simulate what we call a random walk that tracks the trajectory of some sort of unknown process. Now, I can design Monte Carlo algorithms to simulate a lot of different things. I can simulate the movement of stock prices up and down. If you look at the stock price of whatever your favorite company is, it may go up, it may go down. It's kind of a random walk. That's the best model we have of stock prices. If you'd want to forecast a hurricane's trajectory, we're very familiar with looking at the outcome of where a storm may hit with some sort of uncertainty window. And if I want to forecast things where we don't know what's going to happen, these Monte Carlo simulations become incredibly useful. Now, this has driven a lot of supercomputers prior to the AI data center revolution, is the ability, the need to simulate uncertainty at scale. So we decided to take the fact that these neuromorphic chips were able to do sampling in parallel. We asked, how can we reformulate the standard way of doing Monte Carlo to fit onto neuromorphic hardware? Now, this is an awkward thing because this is not a neural network in the classic sense of the word, where you have a layer of neurons and you train it to do some sort of function approximation. But rather, we built a circuit where we connected neurons in very precise ways that basically said if a particle, so to speak, or a random walker moves in my direction, it's going to deliver a spike from one neuron to another according to that random walk. And we can basically build a giant mesh of neurons that allow these random walks to float on top of the mesh of neurons. It's an unusual algorithm, I will admit. I think it's something that we have trouble explaining because it's not what the brain does. It's not what neural networks do, but it's actually a very nice fit for this need to simulate many particles in parallel or many random walkers in parallel. And you just basically let them go on the neuromorphic hardware, and the only information moving on the chip are the random walk processes that we are trying to track. And ultimately, what you want from a Monte Carlo algorithm is what we call a probability distribution, which is kind of looking at the range of possible outcomes of your simulation. And what you get in the end of this neuromorphic random walk algorithm is that probability distribution. So you look at where all the spikes ended up after so many time steps, and that gives you the uncertainty window of whatever it is you're trying to simulate.
Great. The paper that you recently published on arXiv, first of all, before we talk about the paper itself, I should ask you, has that been submitted for publication? As a journalist, I'm always suspicious of arXiv papers, although I've read it very carefully and it looks pretty solid to me, but I'm not a theoretical computer scientist.
So I will say that I did something that I almost never do, which is I actually did what I'd call a true preprint on this. It's something that we'd been talking about in the field for a while, something I've been working on for a while. And I put the paper up on arXiv in order to basically start a conversation. The goal is to submit it and publish, of course, peer review. Coming from neuroscience, I barely believe conference papers. I want to see a rigorous journal publication behind everything. And that is the plan. But it is really at this point meant to start a conversation. The theoretical framework is something that the neuromorphic field really is in need of.
Okay, so talk about that. Talk about what the motivation was for the work itself, and then we'll get into exactly what the framework looks like.
Yeah, so, as we were talking about a few minutes ago with the random walk algorithms, we've started seeing in other cases these examples where neuromorphic hardware appears to be really effective at doing certain classes of computation and not necessarily other things. And this is a very, I wouldn't say concerning, but it's something which is somewhat thought-provoking because we have this intuition of what neuromorphic hardware should be good at, which is what our brains are good at. The problem is we have a lot of trouble defining what it is our brains are doing. I mean, there's a whole field of neuroscience which is struggling with this all the time. So what I was thinking when I put together this proposed framework was, can we step back and look at the idea of neuromorphic hardware today? And when I say neuromorphic hardware, I mean specifically the large-scale, scalable platforms like we're seeing from Intel and Spinnaker and SpinCloud and other people, going back to True North and those programmable circuits of spiking neurons in a sense. And I don't mean it to be that's what neuromorphic is. I just think that's the thing where you can start asking these deeper questions. And if we look at that class of computer architectures and say, what is this good for? What classes of algorithms would be particularly well suited for this class of architectures? I think you see two things possibly pop up. The first is kind of an obvious advantage to the neuromorphic field because it says, okay, what applications should we drive forward on in order to say, this is where the big win is? We all have our ideas. And we have these sort of examples. We have the random walk example. Other people are doing state space models, and they're exciting ideas. But at some point, as a field, we kind of need to demonstrate something to the world that say neuromorphic can do this at a scale that other approaches can't do. This sort of value proposition question that we all get. The other side that I think is personally very exciting for me is that if we can clarify that clearly, what sorts of computations neuromorphic hardware is good at doing. Well, this hardware is inspired by the brain. And that may help provide us some bounding boxes for what things the brain is actually doing. And this is a backwards way of going about understanding how the brain works, where people look at some cognitive function that the brain does and says, well, I would solve this problem in this way. So presumably the brain is doing it the same way. Well, the brain is not doing it the same way. The brain is using millions, if not billions of neurons in some sort of very complex circuitry to solve this problem. So how is the brain solving that problem? Well, if we're able to delineate what large populations of neurons operating in parallel are good at and what they're not good at, kind of both sides are important, then that will help us perhaps constrain a little bit of the searching we're doing in the neuroscience field. So I think that the advantage of a theoretical framework is pretty timely right now because the neuroscience field is looking for paths forward and the neuromorphic field is looking for a clear distinction of what makes it powerful and situates it against other forms of computer architectures like GPUs and neural network accelerators and quantum and all the other exciting things happening. Simply inspired by the brain is not good enough. We need to be able to say neuromorphic is good at this.
Okay, so that's great for the motivation. I have to say to readers, I don't often give compliments about writing. I'm often very jaded about the quality of scientific writing, but I have to say your papers, even theoretical paper like this one, is really well written and very approachable. One of the things that I thought was nice about it in particular was it takes things that almost subconsciously everyone in the field in neuromorphic engineering knows, but maybe doesn't have at the front of their mind all the time. One in particular is the fact that the algorithm is the hardware network itself, which I thought was very nice because we think about algorithms in terms of being learning algorithms, but actually in a neuromorphic network, that's all encoded in the hardware, right? It's all to do with the states of the hardware. So maybe you could talk us through that and some of the other elements of your framework and how they fit together and maybe some of the specific results. So answer that question or hint at the answers. What is neuromorphic good for?
First off, I appreciate the compliment on the writing. I enjoy writing quite a bit, and so it is something that's a lot of fun to do. Maybe to get to that main thing you brought up, which is the algorithm is the hardware, and this sort of tight relationship, the coupling of what neuromorphic hardware is doing and what the circuitry is and everything like that. Like you say, there's a lot of things that we all appreciate in the field, and often is part of the culture of the field that is never explicitly stated, is that neuromorphic is non-von Neumann, it's in-memory computing, it's event-driven. It's a list of these sort of characteristics that are often listed out as this is what it is. And in a sense, the non-von Neumann thing in particular is von Neumann architectures are evil and terrible, and we're so much better because we're non-von Neumann. Well, a little reality check. Von Neumann architectures have taken over the world. Our lives are tremendously better because of von Neumann architectures. The computers we're on today, the AI tools that we use, everything is because of von Neumann architectures. Von Neumann architectures are fantastic. So what is special about the brain not being a von Neumann architecture? What's special about it doing something in this different way? I think it's not inherently an advantage. So where is that advantage? And that's kind of the way I try to think through some of these things. And again, this is, I'm not a computer architecture expert. I'm not a theoretical computer scientist. I'm a neuroscientist originally. So that's part of my perspective here. So in the brain and in our neuromorphic architectures, there is no memory. We call it in-memory computing at times, but there's no memory. I mean, the memory in the computer world is I have a piece of hardware, RAM, SRAM, DRAM, whatever, that's sitting off on the side of my computing logic. And I'm passing instructions back and forth determined by some program that resides in the memory and data back and forth that resides in that memory. Neuromorphic hardware does not have this. If you're doing a good job with your neuromorphic algorithms, there is no program, so to speak, other than the circuit of neurons that we've laid out there. Again, this is kind of something we all intuit, how we describe things, but the implication of that is rather substantial because what it says is that if I want to put a model on some AI model, for instance, that's, I don't know, 1 trillion parameters or 100 billion parameters, the things that we're seeing today on neuromorphic hardware, I don't have the luxury of having a terabyte or whatever of memory sitting off on the side of my neuromorphic chip that I can randomly access according to where I am on that model. I have to encode it in the algorithm itself, right? So this is a constraint. The fact that it's in-memory computing, that we're non-von Neumann, is actually a constraint. It kind of limits what it is neuromorphic hardware could be expected to do because I have to represent the whole program at a time in the circuit. Of course, our brains do this quite well, right? We just don't use trillion parameter models to do things. We have to think of other ways to do it. And so the way that approaching this theoretical framework and the way I proposed it the way that I did is that given these sort of constraints, The fact that there's a neuron for every logical neuron operation, that neuron has to exist in the hardware somewhere. This provides a guide for how you're going to want to construct algorithms. Because it's no longer just, oh, we're going to have an extra layer of neurons over here because that's easier. It's just a line in PyTorch. So let's just add an extra line and add another layer of neurons. All it is just some more memory. Well, that's not the case for neuromorphic. We actually have to be very intentional about what neurons we use where. And we've seen this in all of the neuromorphic algorithms that have been successful to date. Neurons aren't just kind of thrown at problems willy-nilly, but rather it's very intentional about how we use them. And so that's kind of one of the guiding ideas. And I think it's the same for the fact that things are event-driven. And I think this leads into maybe the question about what the sort of implications of this are. So we all talk about spiking as if spiking is a wonderful thing. And again, neuroscientists, neurons spikes are great. But what ultimately does this mean? Well, event-driven means that neurons are processing information if and when it receives inputs that tell it that it should process information. We can see there's an immediate advantage for energy there because you're not wasting computation when nothing is happening. But if you think through this, one implication of this is you can't really have an event-driven neuron in a von Neumann architecture. Because if it's von Neumann, I have to pull in my neuron and check, is there something happening here? No. Okay, I'm going to put it back in memory and go on to the next neuron. Well, by that logic, I've already processed that neuron. In order to have a true event-driven neuron, you really need it to exist statically in the network, sitting there silent, not doing anything. If I'm referencing it back and forth to memory constantly, I lose all the benefit of being event-driven. And this is where, by thinking through what event-driven and in-memory computing means, we can start seeing some real advantages for neuromorphic hardware, particularly on the energy side.
That makes perfect sense. I do remember that you did have a couple of things that you thought that neuromorphic did have advantages over von Neumann or GPU-based computing. Maybe you'd like to talk about those.
So if you think through this idea that an event-driven neuron that is truly event-driven, which means I don't do anything with it, I don't touch it unless it receives inputs that tell it to spike, and thus it tells its downstream targets that it should do something. If that's where the energy advantages come from, and again, like you said, Sunny, this is kind of what we all believe in the neuromorphic field. It's just we don't necessarily think through what the implications of that are. What you really want is you want algorithms that basically try to approach some solution, and the closer you get to a solution, you don't need to spike anymore, right? The activity of a neuron, the movement of information, is where energy cost tends to come from. And this is the case for neuromorphic, it's the case for conventional, it's the case for supercomputers, it's the case for cloud computing. Moving information is the energy cost in today's electronics. So we want algorithms that do not require us to move information as much. And the unfortunate reality of this is not probably modern AI methods. If I want to take a dense linear algebra algorithm, the sort that you have in a transformer network, say in a large language model, if I put that in neuromorphic hardware, every element of those matrices has to be updated and checked and moved. The data movement's going to be the same, whether I use spikes or floating point numbers. It's a lot of data. It's going to scale with the complexity of the algorithm. But if I construct an algorithm to do something different, if I do something which might be an iterative algorithm, which is kind of optimizing for a solution or searching for a solution, and the closer I get to the solution I want, I can maybe drop neurons out of the computation, no longer use them, and focus only on those neurons that are allowing me to get closer and closer to what it is I'm looking for. So recursive algorithms, optimization algorithms. In numerical computing, we often talk about iterative methods for doing things like sparse linear solvers. Things like that tend to be the sorts of algorithms that I would hypothesize are going to be very good candidates for neuromorphic hardware, which I would also say are the sorts of things that the brain appears to do. If you look at how neural computation in, say, the motor cortex looks, it's very dynamical. It appears to be kind of settling on solutions. Decision-making is taking a lot of possible actions and narrowing down to a small subset that might be worth considering. And we see this in systems neuroscience, especially for higher level areas of the brain, higher level cortices. And I think our neuromorphic algorithms that may fine-tune a solution allow us to, in an event-driven way, drop more and more neurons out of the computation and focus only on those that are given the answers I want. The energy cost should drop tremendously as we get closer to the answers that we need, which is not going to be the case if you do these same calculations on conventional hardware. And so this is a case where I think that you would see a real, what I believe, and again, not a theoretical computer scientist, but I would hypothesize that you will see a formal theoretical advantage for neuromorphic computing on this class of algorithms as compared to maybe a conventional von Neumann architecture.
So you said just there and previously, you're not a theoretical computer scientist. So are you working with theoretical computer scientists to nail some of this down?
Yes. So I think one of the things that I have really enjoyed my time at Sandia is that we're a computing research center. I think the official title of our group is Center for Computing Research. And I've had the pleasure of working with some very good theoretical computer scientists over the years, as well as mathematicians in a very formal sense of the word, right? In neuroscience and in the neuromorphic computing field, we don't really have theorems and proofs. That's just not how we tend to do things. And in the paper that you're referencing, I don't have lots of theorems and proofs, but I think ultimately this is something that the neuromorphic community really needs. We need to have this sort of strong theoretical foundation for what it is we're working on. It's something that the quantum computing field does have and has benefited from tremendously because it allows the algorithms developers to focus on algorithms and the hardware developers to focus on hardware, and they all have this sort of common reference to point to. We don't have that. And I would argue one reason we don't have that is this lack of theoretical computer science in our field. My hope is, call it a call to arms in a sense, but it's an attempt to see if we can bring our field closer to some of this more rigorous formal computer science research that does exist and say, look, there's some real things about this type of computing that merits the sort of deeper, more theoretical computer science interrogation that honestly, very few people in the neuromorphic computing field, I think, are qualified to do on their own. I think it's something that we need to expand our community to include.
Fantastic. Before you go, Brad, you've had the opportunity to do what many people have not, which is to play with some really, and I mean really large neuromorphic platforms. Can you talk a bit about what that's like and what you've learned from it?
So at Sandia, we have, at the current time, I would say probably the world's largest neuromorphic platform in a billion neuron hollow point system from Intel Loihitu. And we have a large Spinnaker 2 kind of box that has several million neurons in that. And we've had previously, over the last several generations of this hardware, very large-scale systems. And I won't take credit for bringing those in. My colleague Craig Vineyard at Sandia has been very proactive in developing a lot of these relationships and building up a very big test bed here for us to use. I think that the thing that I benefit most is being on the algorithms side of having this large-scale capability at our disposal is it forces us to think about what it means to scale algorithms up. And I think that's something that is just very hard when you have a few dozen or a few hundred neurons on a chip in front of you, and it's kind of a static size, right? The immediate goal is what can I do with those 1,000 neurons? What can I do with those 100 neurons? And people can do all sorts of amazing things with those 1,000 neurons. But my belief, and National Labs, we build supercomputers and things, is if we have this capability that's going to scale up indefinitely, our brains are billions of neurons, about 80 to 100 billion neurons in our brains, what does that give us? And so this ability to actually have platforms that aren't just a chip with 100,000 neurons or 10,000 neurons, but rather 10,000 of those chips next to each other and say, what can we do with that? That forces us to think about algorithms in a different way. It's not just an example, right? But rather we have to think of something that's scalable. And ultimately, we see this in AI today. The scalability of algorithms is what drives performance. It's what drives excitement. It's driving the market. Simple, small neural networks never did anything. They only got exciting when people made them big. And so I don't know if we have enough neurons yet in our neuromorphic systems. I think we're at a point where we can start asking this question more seriously. I do think a few thousand neurons just probably isn't going to cut it for real world impact for neuromorphic outside of some edge cases. And I think there's some really exciting things going on there. But for this sort of more complex algorithms, whether it's machine learning or numerical computing, we need the ability to scale our algorithms up to millions of neurons, if not billions. And I think we need that hardware in front of us to actually remind us that that's the scale at which we need to target.
Brad Aimone, thanks so much for coming on to Brains and Machines.
Thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Sunny. I enjoyed listening to Brad so much that I forgot that I had to come out with questions at the end. And for more about Brad Aimone's work, please go to brainsandmachines.net. And now we welcome back our regular commentator, Professor Ralph Etienne Cummings from Johns Hopkins University.
Hi, guys. How are you doing? Happy to talk about Brad's work. Really interesting stuff.
Hi, Ralph. Hi, Sunny. So, yes, it's super exciting. And the first thing that caught my attention is Rusty Gage lab at the Salk. That has been one of the first labs to study adult neurogenesis. And I was looking at some of the news around, and what he said is the adult brain is far more adaptable than what we thought it was. And then I kind of kept digging, and I found a nice paper that is called Involvement of Transposable Elements in Neurogenesis. So during neurogenesis, we have a special genetic element called transposable elements or jumping genes that plays this active role. And when they move to new position into the DNA of new developing neurons, they create small genetic differences among individual neurons, which is called somatic mosaicism, which is mosaic. And this helps regulate genes controlling neuron development and influences memory formation. So it ended up that this is super important for brain health. And if misregulated, they might contribute to brain disorder and potentially influencing conditions like depression, schizophrenia, and Alzheimer's disease. Did you know anything about that? To me, this was super interesting to read through this news.
I know a little bit about that because I've just been reading Kandel's book, In Search of Memory, which I have to say was recommended by Themis Podramakis. So thank you, Themis, for that, which is a lovely book about his journey in neuroscience. And to be honest, as a physicist, I had no idea that genes were even involved in memory. So I was feeling very ignorant as I was reading through and understanding about all these genetic switches that have to go on and off in order for long-term memories to be stored. But it is fascinating stuff. I would just like to say that this book of Kandel's is very readable. So if you're an ignoramus like I am on the biological front, it would be the one to choose.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting stuff. But I liked the whole idea of the neurons being in different points in the generational flow, right? Like the baby neurons and the adolescent neuron and the aged neuron. And the point is that when you get to the new ideas, you cannot depend on the age, which is me here, right? Specialized, can't really think outside the box. The important thing, though, I think, is this whole notion of avoiding catastrophic forgetting, right? Because that's one of the basic problems of online learning. As you learn new things, do you forget the old ones? And having these two types of neurons with different specialties and mission capabilities is an interesting way to keep that information from the past while you're acquiring new information, which is really wonderful in my view.
So I loved this analogy of the professor and experts, and then at some point they need new, fresh minds. And this is a strange question, so it's not technical. But do you think we are nurturing enough the young generation to excite them to continue pushing this community?
So as a head of a research lab, that's exactly our goal, right? In any one of these research labs, you have the senior professor being the head, and then you have the postdocs, and you have the grad students, and then undergrads, and high school students even, right? So we do create that hierarchy, at least in the United States, that allows us to keep bringing in these fresh minds. One of the aspects, I would say, of the American mechanism for teaching in universities is that we tend to allow direct confrontation, if you will, right? Direct questioning of the dogma of what is believed to be true by folks at different level of the learning process. And I think that's a good thing. And that follows onto that same notion of bringing in new minds at all times.
It's been my perception that older people can be a problem. I do get sick sometimes of hearing people who are my age, older, saying things like, oh, but we tried that and it didn't work. And the thing is, sometimes an idea's time has not yet come because the hardware wasn't there. The theory wasn't there, the whatever wasn't there. So I definitely see a problem with that. One of the things I think you don't want to forget, though, is that long memories can be really useful. So if you have a combination between young people with fresh ideas and old fogies like Ralph and myself who have been around for 40 years. So, for instance, I was thinking, whatever happened with that entropy versus connectivity paper that Abu Mustafa wrote in the 80s, which I remember hearing about in the 90s? Was that valid? So this was to do with how many interconnections do you need between neurons in order to get interesting behaviors between them or as a network? So I think if you just have the young energy ideas, they're reinventing the wheel because they don't know what people have tried before. So I think you need both. And maybe that is completely self-serving as someone who's closer to 60 than 50, but there you go.
No, we definitely need both. I mean, from my side, as a early career researcher, I would love to have more colleagues around me of my age and definitely more women. But I don't want to make it political. Let's stop it here. But we do need to have mentors, right? And the problem is when mentors become competitive and it doesn't make any sense anymore, right? Because it's really difficult to find mentors like you guys. Yes, I want to make a compliment to you guys because it's really nice to learn from you. And this is nurturing for real. So if you allow me, I will go back to Brad. I'd like to talk about one of his papers, which is talking about adult neurogenesis and introduces new neurons that provide structural plasticity, enabling the brain to dynamically adapt and reorganize circuits over time. Now, my question was, I used to work with Spinnaker at the start of my PhD, and it was very intuitive, right? But I know that once you have loaded the network, then you can't just pop in a new neuron. So if we would like to use it, because we can see from what he's saying that it's really useful, how could we model it on neuromorphic hardware?
I was thinking about this actually as I was interviewing Brad, and the obvious way, or at least it seemed to me, not as an engineer who has to do this in real life, so I defer to Ralph about this, but it seemed to me that as long as the number of neurons does not grow overall, as long as you have this concept of neurons that are dying and neurons that are becoming teenagers again, there should be a way to do that. That as neurons are identified as being less relevant, or as the network learns that they are less relevant, they have less good stuff coming into them, less interesting stuff coming out of them, they can be kind of repurposed in some way and start getting lots of information again. Now, I don't know physically how you would do that, but it doesn't seem to me it's outside the realms of possibility. But maybe Ralph can say that better.
So, it's ironic because I have a student who's working exactly on this problem, right? And somebody that Julia, very well. He's a quasi, right? He's coming about it from a sparsity perspective. And there is essentially dynamic sparsity and static sparsity, right? Static sparsity usually means that somehow you've decided which neurons are in the game and which neurons are not, and they stay that way forever. Dynamic sparsity basically says, no, we are going to bring neurons in and out of the game according to what the input that's coming in, what it's saying. And we use, in our case, saliency, basically what is important in the data, as the gating mechanism. So ultimately, you can construct the similar flow. And we've shown that if you look at the latency of computation, how much it takes to actually get to us to a result. When you bring in this combination of, let's call it unit sparsity and data sparsity and connection sparsity, when you bring all these together, you end up reducing the amount of latency significantly in making decisions. So in a similar way, you could, to flow back now to what Sunny just said, you can use similar kind of techniques. And with the Spinnaker platform, especially Spinnaker 2, we've been able to actually do that by changing how the matrix multiplications happen, how the weights are updated, and all those kinds of things. And that's a paper that's in development as we speak right now. So it can be done. A couple of things that he said that I do have some pushback on. I mean, and I understand that he's setting up these large simulation environments or large networks of neurons, Ascendia, but there is a place for a small number of neurons to play a role, right? A big role, an important role, which is, the prosthetic space. You're not going to put an entire rack of machine inside the body, right? So you're going to have a small number of neurons that speaks the same language as a nervous system, that does specific tasks, and there's loops that happens with the control and so on. So that's one thing that I would say that is important. And I don't know whether you guys want to chime in there.
I just want to say that I agree with you, but then he's not at Sandia National Labs for nothing. They do big stuff. They're the D of E, Department of Energy, so they're not doing small things. So I think it's appropriate for them.
Sure.
And I think, he's in a really good position to talk about these big platforms, not to mention that he has the ones to play with. So that's all I'd say in his defense there.
Yeah, no, I'm not attacking. So you don't need to defend. I'm just putting it in perspective that there are other places where small numbers of neurons may actually matter. And the other part that I wanted to indicate, and I think it maybe goes back to the same notion that we just talked about in terms of the sparsity, right? I mean, I've been thinking a little bit more recently about how the world is intentionally sparse. Information comes in stochastic, time-distributed manners. The actual information that's flowing in doesn't cover all aspects of all the domains in which it comes from. It's sparse in its own way and so on. So by definition, the sparsity requires then that we have a dynamic process by which we can take advantage of the connectivity and so on in such a way that we can get the maximum capability out of it. So having the means of interacting with the real world implies that you have to do sparse computation. So you're not doing this dense matrix multiplication that is required whenever the system is interacting with the real world. So I find that the dense matrix multiplication is actually an artificial construct, not what you would find when you would get your robot, Julia, to look at the world and ICOB to do what it does, right? That information, by its very base nature, requires smaller networks.
Yeah, I've been lately thinking about the sparsity and how much we make up of things when we look around. Because we really see clearly just in 1% of our retina, and everything else is kind of like filling the information. That's why we make up lots of things. And I'm just thinking how much the nowadays DNN is working on dense information and how this is wrong in comparison with how we function. And we function solely because we interact with things and we do not learn objects on its own, but we learn our experience on the object, which implies sensory motor coordination and contingencies and so on and so forth. So I'm super focused on this now.
You know that I come from exactly the same point of view as both of you do, in that we're all interested in robotics and intelligence from an embodied standpoint and all of that stuff. Consequently, I haven't been as interested in the math stuff, right? So there are a lot of people who want to do computation of physical systems, computation of other kinds of complex systems. And Brad's breakout paper, the one that really made him well known, was this one about the Monte Carlo simulations. It's the one that also, I meant to say this, that won him the Mahawald Award. So that work comes in a different scheme of what we're normally interested in, but is still really worthwhile. And there are a bunch of neuromorphic researchers in that domain, which is how do we get neuromorphic advantages for other kinds of computing, for this big computing as opposed to the embodied computing. So I was fascinated by the fact that perhaps because of his lovely writing, he was able to get me interested in this subject, which hitherto I have been very good at resisting, shall we put it that way?
Yeah, I get your point. And I think that, like we said, there's a space for all of these different aspects. So when we are talking about real world application, I tend to see the roles of maybe smaller networks as being more valued, more applicable and useful. Another aspect that I liked in this description was this notion of, having proofs and theorems for neuromorphic engineering. And I think that is entirely true, right? We are missing any real fundamental bounds, what is possible and what's not possible. So I was fortunate to be at a National Academies talk a few days ago, where somebody was exactly talking about how can you prove certain guarantees that networks can provide. Now, he was speaking about it entirely from the learning theory perspective, right? There are n numbers of different networks or models, and you want to try to say, is this or that model the best for this particular set of problems? And how do you prove the guarantees that each one of these models will provide? So I think people are starting to speak to that. And the gentleman's name is Carey Priebe, and he's primarily a statistician and applied mathematician. And I'm hoping that folks also from control theory can provide additional input, because they prove a lot of theorems, right? And they are all about bounds and what is possible and what is not. So I'm hoping that we can get information from them.
I have been looking at the information theory behind all of this stuff and really feeling like I'm beating my head against a wall, because there is so relatively little and nothing is universal. I want a theory that says, if you have, and this comes up all the time, even within the podcast, if you have a theory about the complexity of the individual neurons, the number of connections between neurons, and perhaps also the amount of information that is passed through those connections. That could be by the rate, that could be by the number of bits, because we get multi-event bits that are passed around also. How do we have a theory about the total size of the problem that you can solve? Now, one of the things I liked about Brad's paper that got me thinking along these lines, he talks about the fact that in a neuromorphic network, unlike in a conventional DNN, you have this problem that the hardware and the algorithm are the same thing. So you need to have a theory about, if you have this big of an algorithm, this big of a network, what size of a problem can you solve on it? And really, a DNN can be thought of as being maybe a special case of a neuromorphic network, right? It's just a very limited version of what a neuromorphic network can do. So where is this theory? So I found some really nice stuff on the biological side. There's a guy called Bialik at Princeton who's been involved at this since the late 80s, doing coding in the blowfly. Ralph and I were talking about this the other day. He was one of the co-authors of this book called Spikes that was published in the 90s. He produced this paper about the information bottleneck, talking about how different kinds of codes had different kinds of value in the brain and how you could do trade-offs between them. So there's been this really nice piece of work being done focused on the spiking biological side. Where are people on the neuromorphic side taking that theory and saying, and what this means is that we can now do this?
There is a little bit of theory back in the day, right? In fact, that is what Hoffield won his award for, which is a Hoffield net, associative memory. And there was a theory that basically said, this is the maximum number of memories you can store in a network of n size, which is n log n, basically. But that was developed through rigorous information theory perspectives. And I think it was Santosh Venkatesh, when he was a student with Hopfield, who developed it at the time.
We'll make sure that reference gets into the show notes.
Yeah, please. So the point is that at the early stages, I think, when they were being developed, when neuromorphic was becoming a thing, there was a theoretical element and a practical element that kind of moved together. But I think at some point there was a divergence, because also that was a very specific problem. It was just associative memories, not all the other applications that we're dealing with at this time. One thing that he said that I thought was kind of interesting, he says, as you get closer to a solution, your neurons should be less and less active because essentially you are converging. But isn't that adaptation? Isn't that exactly the more you see something, you basically adapt to a low and low and low firing rate until eventually you have some base firing rate that you get to. So I wonder if in some sense, having temporal dynamics and temporal properties of these neurons will basically take care of such adaptations.
Where are the complexity theorists? These are the people I think we need to be delving into this stuff.
I think they have to be mathematicians. They are applied math guys.
We need them.
Yeah.
I don't want to read their papers, but I want to know what they find out.
Let's stop it here for today. Thank you, Sunny, for yet another great interview, and Ralph for your insightful comments, as usual. In the next episode, Sunny will talk to Professor Claudia Lenk from the University of Ulm in Germany. We hope you will join us then.
That brings another episode of EETimes Current to its end. Thank you for listening, and thanks again to our guest, Dr. Brad Aimone. EETimes Current is available through all the major podcast platforms, but if you get to us at our website at eetimes.com, you'll find a transcript, along with direct links to the other stories we've mentioned and other resources. Thanks for listening.